we said we might talk a little bit about historical composition and the way that counterpoint worked in practice in the 16th and 15th centuries. So I chose this example. This is from Ornithoparchus's treatise. Um, and it's a really interesting comment because it says something quite remarkable about compositional practice from this period. If you don't mind, I'll just read this out loud.
Yeah.
It will be necessary for the beginners of this art to form a 10-line scale. Now, sorry to interrupt already. Perhaps you better go to the next slide to show you what that means. So a 10-line scale here, this is from the same treatise, is functioning in much the way that you might expect a modern score to function. You have like a little grid, let's say, with each brevis, each breve, barred off in a way that is organized. It looks in a way like a modern score. You have the clefs up on the left-hand side.
Yeah.
You have here the gamma ut at the bottom, F clef, C clef, G clef, and then it's showing you the D above that as well. But it's essentially functioning as a way of organizing it visually on a page. So that's what he means when he says 10-line stave. We can go back now, perhaps.
Okay.
Separated by bar lines. So here we are. So this is for beginners, so that they can write each breve within each bar properly marked with clefs, so as not to be hindered by a confused mixture of notes. However, it's better to compose without a 10-line scale, without this sort of score. But because it's difficult, let the young people begin with a 10-line scale, with this sort of score. So the point of this is that he's saying what I think we might all agree with, that it's pretty much easier to perform when to compose when writing in score format than when not. And he's saying this because the evidence really points to the fact that the vast majority of written composition during this period was written not in score format. And that's why he's saying it's for beginners to do this. Bermudo, who's writing a couple of decades later, even says that writing in score is simply for people who don't know counterpoint. And the point is that if you don't write in score, you have to be able to count very carefully. And if you're not writing in score, it's very easy to lose count. So I think this points to one of the most remarkable, at least from our perspective, remarkable facts of Renaissance and medieval compositional practice, that these people were writing counterpoint without any direct vertical alignment, at least in a lot of the examples we have. And of course, there are some exceptions.
Wow.
You couldn't possibly say that every composer from the 17th or 18th century was in the same way. There's variety in this period as well. But the vast majority of theoretical sources and also surviving manuscript sources suggest that an actual score wasn't used by the most advanced composers. There's a great study by Jessie Ann Owens called Composers at Work. It's quite old by now, I think, but I still recommend it as a reference work for my students on historical compositional practice, which really goes into great details about this. And she basically comes up with the conclusion that the majority of that it was common to write in what she calls quasi-score, so where the voices are on top of each other but not aligned, so you can follow along quite easily as you go if you're comfortable with mensural notation. But that actually writing in score was not common during this period. In fact, it seems to have become more common throughout the 16th century. Calvisius, for example, at the end of the 16th century, there we are, that's the one. For an easy $55, is that great? Calvisius, at the end of the 16th century, for example, says that older musicians of the previous generation, used to compose in 5 lines, so with the independent lines. However, modern composers will write in a score. But it seems really that this is quite clear from the 15th and 16th centuries, that the majority of composers were writing without a score in front of them, which is pretty wild.
What do they do then? So wait, sorry, hold on. If they don't do that, what do they do? Like,
what do they do? Good question. So perhaps I'm not very good at answering your questions. I'm going to go take another detour.
No, this is great. People like this.
One thing I find really interesting is what they didn't do. And I say this because I approach this music really as a singer, and although I do have some keyboard skills, it's not my way of thinking. I think, as I sort of said, now with the hand and with solmization, etc. But there is a fascinating quote by Hermann Fink, who's a theorist in the middle of the century, who criticizes composers. And he says, actually, in fairness, that a lot of composers are doing this, but they shouldn't. He criticizes composers for composing at the keyboard. He says that some composers nowadays are learning how to. Oh yeah, I included it. There we are. They tinker with a clavichord for a long time until, with whatever habit they have acquired, they learn to notice a certain harmony by the touch of the keys and the articulation of the fingers, and learn to transfer it to paper from there. And so at last they produce a composition full of pauses and mistakes without regard to the mode. And there are, as I said, a great number of composers of this kind today. Now, I
I
find this
really like the full stop, and there are a great number of composers. I almost I can draw out the dryness just from that line.
the passive aggressive text speak full stop. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I find this fascinating because this, for me at least, flies directly in the face of what you expect from a 17th, 18th century source on composition, and from my experience as well. When I was writing fugue or realizing partimenti, actually a big part of the battle was trying to get my fingers, get the muscle memory of the chord shapes really into my fingers. And I think that's a very reasonable pedagogical approach, and I think it's a very successful pedagogical approach. I also play the lute, and I can really feel the chord shapes, the shapes when I'm playing. But what's fascinating about this is that he says, no, that's not the way to do it, and that will, in fact, cause bad counterpoints. Now, I'm sure that's not always the case.
Didn't Bach talk about harpsichord knights or something who were just I know there's a quote that he was like saying that people compose with their fingers or something. So I think there's something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting.
But anyway, sorry, you were saying.
No, that's good. And so what actually the majority of sources that I've come across seem to suggest is that you do is essentially you write one line and then you write another line against it. Dramatic, I know. And so Vicentino, who's writing a little bit earlier in the century than Fink, if I remember correctly, he has some interesting comments on checking music, that the way to check, because if you're not writing in score, it's difficult, of course, to align all the parts. The way to check it is to follow each line in tandem. So you follow each line individually. You do the soprano against the alto, then you read the soprano against the tenor, then you read the soprano against the bass, then you read the alto against the tenor, then the alto against the bass, then the tenor against the bass. So it's essentially checking a series of duets in order to see how it works. Because, of course, contrapuntal pedagogy, through the lens of both writing and chant sur le livre, improvised counterpoint, is essentially a two-part activity. It's the process of adding a single voice or many single voices to something that's pre-existing, right? And so I think that's a really revealing comment, which gives a little bit of insight into how this works. And I like the idea of counting in particular for several different reasons. So we know that composers relied a lot on simply counting breves, collections of, let's say like the equivalent of bars, perfections. They relied on counting breves to do this because we have a series of letters between these two theorists, Spataro and Aaron, and they are exchanging all sorts of interesting theoretical ideas. But in one of them, a mistake is pointed out in a composition by Spataro, if I remember correctly. And Spataro says something like, oh, I'm sorry, I made a mistake because I wrote the number 9 for 9 breves after this passage, but I meant to write the number 8. So he's miscounted. And so I think that's a really fascinating point, that they seem to have worked in these little blocks. They create phrases of, well, in this case, 8 or 9 breves, and then they join them together. So it's this additive process, which is fascinating, I think.
Now, why don't just have them all in a score and then you can just see it, right?
I actually not sure I could fully answer that without making it up as I go along. I also find it quite interesting that it's not that Ornithoparchus, for example, is unaware of the existence of scores, or in this case, the 10-line stave. And in fact, scores you do find throughout the 16th century, really, in various different formats, mostly for study purposes by the sound of things. But that for some reason, and this I'm not sure I can tell you why, for some reason it's associated with being a beginner. And there are a few other sources which really say explicitly this. Cochleus says the same. Dressler says the same. That, as I said, Bermudo says exactly the same. That you can write in a score if you're a beginner, but if you're a master, you don't need to. So why would you? And I don't really have a clear answer for that. I could guess that it's maybe something to do with melodic as opposed to vertical thinking. But I'm not sure I can give you a clear answer.